Welcome back to Cantos 32 through 34, the last section of the Inferno. And it's snowing.
Snow.
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 Snow, 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 snow. This is snow, 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 snow.
Bum 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 bum. It's Inferno, Inferno, bida bum 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 bum.
With harsh and clacking rhymes that could convey the nature of that hole of misery on which all other rocks converge and weigh, I would press out the juice more thoroughly from my conception. Lacking them, I fall to the work at hand with some anxiety. To try to describe the very floor of all the universe is nothing to attract an idle mind, no task for tongues that call to mama and papa. Once again, Dante's using that idea of ineffability, the inability to communicate through words. But also, he talks about how language can't quite grasp it. Maybe there is a language, that harsh and clacking rhyme that could convey the horror of what he sees, but he doesn't have it. He hasn't acquired it. He talks about human language being the tongue that calls to mama and papa, that first language that we learn where we call out to our parents. Usually, our very first words are mama and dada, or mama and papa, something like that. So Dante is relating to that idea of language acquisition. The same idea he was touching on just a few moments ago when we were looking at Nimrod. Maybe somewhere there is a perfect language that could convey all of these ideas, but this isn't it. He goes on to describe the treacherous who are in the final circle of hell. O most misbegotten rabble in that den, so hard to speak of. Better far had you been born as sheep or goats instead of men. He says that these people would be better off being beasts. Now we've seen earlier in the Inferno that people were compared to beasts in the violent circle. That violent nature which is so bestial, but here he's saying they're lower than the beasts. You all would be better off being beasts. Down in the dark pit we'd been carried to, far beneath the giant's feet, I was standing where I had an enormous wall still fixed in view, when I heard a voice that said to me, "Take care not to step upon the poor heads as you pass of the weary brothers who are lying there." Then I saw around me, under me, a mass of solid water, a lake so frozen over that it looked much less like water than like glass. The dolorous souls in the ice were livid, till their heads emerged with faces shame had dyed. Their teeth were clicking like the stork's long bill. Each face looked down. Their mouths all testified to the bitter cold, and all their eyes were signed with the depths of misery that gnawed inside. Alright, so Dante on the frozen lake of Ch34, the final river. It's frozen over, and the treacherous souls whose hearts were so cold and so calculating in their sin are down here in the depths, frozen. Just the tops of their bodies are peeking out, and they're leaning hunched over against the wind. Whew. They're cold because of their cold hearts, but also because they are the farthest away from God's love and light. These are the most willful, the most calculating, and the most cold. And Ch34 is made up of 4 rings. This is the first one. This is Caena. And he looks down and he sees 2 brothers who were stuck together, forehead to forehead. "Tell me," I said to them, "who you may be, frozen chest to chest." They craned their necks, and when they turned their faces up to look at me, their eyes, which had been only moist within, now overflowed. Tears trickled down and froze and locked them even tighter than they'd been. 2 boards were never clamped as close as those 2 souls. Like goats, they butted head to head because such anger held them in its throes. This is Alessandra and Napoleone, 2 brothers who fought over their inheritance and killed each other. And because of this, they're frozen together forever in Caena, the treacherous to family. Notice how they don't want to be identified. It's only another soul nearby that identifies them. In fact, down here in the deepest part of hell, usually the sinners try as hard as they can to avoid identification. They don't want to be recognized for being the worst sinners of all time. He moves on saying, "Then I saw 1,000 faces that the chill had purpled, and I shudder to this day when I cross a frozen stream, and I always will. And I was shivering as we made our way through the endless cold to find that central place where all gravity collects." Notice how he keeps referencing the center of the world, the center of gravity, but also he makes that connection back to Dante the Traveler and Dante the Poet. Both of them are shivering at the horror of this. This is the most horrifying place ever. He connects the idea of shivering from the cold to shuddering from horror. I cannot say whether will or fate or pure chance was the case, but passing among the heads, my foot swung out and kicked one hard directly in the face. He wailed at me and began to shout, "What is this? If you're not here to heap on revenge for Monteperti, why knock me about?" So Dante meets with another soul who's frozen down in the ice here. He accidentally kicks his face, and now we've come to the next ring of Ch34, which is Antenora, those who are treacherous against their own country. Then I turned back to the soul who was still raving while my leader had stopped. "Just who are you," I said, "to criticize how others are behaving?" "Stomping through Antenora to kick the head of anyone you please, just who are you?" he asked. "It would be too much if you weren't dead." I'm not dead, I replied, and if it's true that you crave fame, it's worth your while to know that among the others I will name you too. He said, I crave the opposite. Now go, get out of here. Leave me to my share, since you don't know how to flatter souls this low. I answered as I seized him by the hair upon his nape, Now tell me what you're called, or else you won't have a tuft left anywhere. And he replied, Go ahead and strip me bald. I won't tell or show my face. Not if you land on my head 1,000 times and leave it mauled. I took his hair and wrapped it around my hand as he barked and looked straight down to hide his brow, and I'd already pulled out more than one strand when another shouted, Boca, what ails you now? So this is Boca. He's a Ghibelline who infiltrated the Gulf army and caused all kinds of chaos in the Gulf ranks when he cut down the flag bearer. Again, he doesn't want to be identified. These souls don't want to be recognized down this low. But Dante says, I'll pull out all your hair unless you tell me. It's interesting that down here with the treacherous, Dante shows some treachery. He yanks out the hair of this guy, causing him to expose his secret, betraying his secret. Later on, he's going to commit a very direct act of betrayal against one of the souls. He doesn't feel any pity for them down here, showing that they don't deserve any pity. But Dante goes on, and the next sinners he finds are some of the most important in the Inferno. It's Ugolino and Archbishop Ruggieri. After we left him, I saw two together frozen so close in one hole that the head of one was like the hood upon the other. I stood and watched the higher one embed his teeth in the other's nape and brain, and eat the way a starving man devours bread. Oh, you who show such wild hostility, attacking him with bestial violence, tell me why, I said, and if it seems fit to me that you are justified by his events to take such vengeance, then before I die, in the world above, you shall have recompense, unless my tongue should wither and turn dry. Ah, it's cold. Thus begins Canto 33. The darkest canto in the Inferno. He paused in his savage meal and raised his head from the one he'd just been destroying in his fit, and wiped his mouth upon his hair, and said, What, you ask, revives a grief so desperate that its recollection tears my heart, even though I have yet to tell one single word of it. But if my words are seeds from which will grow the fruit of this vile traitor's evil fame, then I shall speak and weep while doing so. There's a lot of emphasis on the idea of devouring here and the idea of eating. The first actual word in this canto is mouth in the Italian, but in English syntax we can't quite pull that off. Notice those first 6 lines that Ugolino says though. As he's speaking, he says, What you ask revives a grief so desperate that its recollection tears my heart, even though I have yet to tell a single word of it. But if my words are a seed from which will grow the fruit of this vile traitor's evil fame, then I shall speak and weep while doing so. Who have we heard say that before? It's Francesca, and she replied, There is no greater woe than looking back on happiness in days of misery. Your guide can tell you so. But if you are so eager to retrace our love's first root, then I will make it known as one who speaks with tears upon her face. In the actual Italian, it's identical between these two. So why does Dante make a connection between the very first sinner we talk to in the lightest form of sin, lust, with the last worst sin of treachery, Ugolino? He seems to bookend the Inferno with this first encounter and this near-to-the-end encounter. Both of these souls have similar attitudes towards their sin. They desire pity from Dante, they cry about it to Dante, and yet they don't take responsibility for it. Francesca blamed poetry and love, and Ugolino blames Archbishop Ruggieri. Both of them tell their story in order to get something out of Dante, to get that pity from him. This is the beginning of our tragic voice in the Inferno. We've noticed Dante change his voice from place to place to place. Well, here he takes on the tragic voice. And if you remember your ideas about tragedy, tragedy includes a tragic hero who has a tragic flaw. Even though he's a great guy, he makes a mistake, leading to his downfall. But in the end, that downfall is so much worse than he actually deserves, and so we pity him and we grieve for him. And yet he can show human strength by standing up in the midst of that trial and gaining some sort of understanding of himself. That's how we usually hear tragedy. Dante takes this tragic voice and applies it to Ugolino and to the rest of this canto. Ugolino wants us to pity him. He wants us to think that his punishment is so much greater than his crime. He begins by introducing himself, saying, I should tell you that my name was Count Ugolino, and this one next to me is Archbishop Ruggieri. All of the souls throughout the Inferno talk about themselves in similar terms. They're all dead, and so they talk about themselves in the past tense. We can see a good example of this at the very beginning of the Inferno with Virgil, the first soul that Dante actually meets. When Dante meets Virgil, he cries out and says, Miserere on me, I cried. Whatever you are, a shade or a solid man? And Virgil replies, Not man, although I was a man. It shows that the souls are no longer human, now they're souls. And so they all talk about themselves in the past tense, including Ugolino. But when he talks about himself in the past tense, he turns around and puts Ruggieri in the present tense. I should tell you that my name was Count Ugolino, and this one next to me is Archbishop Ruggieri. He doesn't want to let go of his anger and his hatred and his loathing of Ruggieri for what Ruggieri did to him. It's as if the crime is always right there in front of him, and he can't let go of it. He begins to tell his story. How I was seized and executed then, having trusted him while he betrayed and lied. There is no need to tell that tale again. But of what you cannot know, the way I died, the cruelty of it. Hear what I have to say. Whether he wronged me, you may then decide. So Ugolino completely glosses over his crime, mentioning only in brief his seizure and execution. It's his death that he really wants to get at because he feels that's where he's been wronged. Forget the things I did. Let's talk about what he did. He begins to tell how he was imprisoned in a tower with his 4 sons, and after relating a terrible dream in which he envisions these political leaders chasing after him and his sons and tearing them apart, he says, "It was not yet dawn, but I no longer slept. My sons were there with me. Though still asleep, they called to me to give them bread and wept. You are cruel indeed if you cannot know the deep dread that I felt, and not yet shed a tear. If not this, what could ever make you weep?" So he's describing how he's locked in a tower with his sons and how they're all going to starve, and he's looking at his sons who are starving, and he says, "You ought to pity me, 'cause that was terrible." It's interesting because he sort of glosses over his son's pain as well and just looks at his own. The time of our morning meal was drawing near. My children were awake. Their dreams had stirred in each of them uneasiness and fear. From the base of the horrible tower I now heard the door being nailed shut, and I looked into the faces of my sons without a word. I did not weep. I was turned to stone all through. And so he describes how he sits there for a day and a night, and then as morning breaks, as soon as a small ray of sunshine shone in the miserable prison, and I could see from their 4 faces the aspect of my own, I bit my hand in grief and agony. And they, assuming that I acted thus from hunger, quickly rose and said to me, "Eat of us, father. It will hurt us less. From you we have this wretched flesh we wear. Now it is yours to take away from us." So notice when he wakes up in the morning and he looks at his sons, what does he see? He sees his own aspect in their faces. He's only paying attention to himself, even as he looks at his sons. His sons, on the other hand, are completely sacrificial. They offer up their own bodies to feed their father, saying, "Hey, you brought us into this world, you can take us out of it. You want to eat us? Go ahead." But he calms himself and they sit silent for 2 more days. It says, "And when it was the 4th day, Gatto cried, 'Father, why don't you help me?' I watched him fall outstretched before my feet, and there he died. Just as you see me now, I saw them all between the 5th and 6th days, one by one, drop down and die. Now blindness cast its pall, and for 2 more days I crawled from sun to sun, calling to them who were already dead. Then fasting did what misery had not done." So the first son calls out, "Father, why don't you help me?" and then dies. And then the rest of them all die over the next couple days. And he crawls around for a while, and hear the last line. "Then fasting did what misery had not done." What does that mean? Well, it implies that he ate his children, that the hunger overcame his misery and he couldn't stand it anymore and so he ate them. But on the other hand, it could mean that fasting did what misery had not done. His misery had not broken his heart and caused him to die, but the fasting did kill him eventually. However, with all the hints dropped about cannibalism beforehand, the sons offering themselves up to their father, the gnawing on Ruggieri's head, it sort of implies that he ate his children. What a horrific end for them. With eyes asquint, having finished what he'd said, as a dog attacks a bone, he turned back to his gnawing of the other's wretched head. Okay, so throughout that, Ugolino was really emphasizing how much Dante ought to pity his horrible fate. Let's see what Dante takes away from this. "Pisa, disgrace of all the peoples who fill the fair land where sea is heard, who show no readiness to rise and punish you. Let Capraea and Gorgona shift, and go to dam the Arno's mouth, so that it may drown all your citizens with its overflow. Even if Count Ugolino did betray your castles, as was reputed, you did wrong to put his sons upon the cross that way. New Thebes, there is no guilt in those so young as Uguicone or Brigata, or the 2 already mentioned in my song." Dante feels great pity, but not for Ugolino. He feels pity for the children. and the way that they sacrificed themselves and they were killed. Did they deserve their fate? No, they were innocent. Ugolino got what was coming to him, but they didn't deserve it. And he curses the city of Pisa for condemning the children as well as the father, telling the islands to rise up and stop up the river, flooding Pisa and wiping it off the map. This is, of course, another example of an apostrophe. Notice the imagery used to describe the sons all throughout this section. We see them as being pure and innocent. We see them as being sacrificial and offering their bodies up for their father. We see them as being extremely obedient to their father, to the point of death. We see the first son who dies call out, "Father, why don't you help me?" Which might sound a little bit like, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" And at the end, when he talks about the sons, he says, "You did wrong to put his sons upon the cross that way." These sons are Christ figures. They've offered themselves up as a sacrifice. And the true tragedy here is that the sacrifice went completely unnoticed by their father, who focused only on his own inward suffering. He's so selfish and so self-absorbed that he doesn't even benefit from the sacrifice of his own sons. And this tragic retelling of Christ's sacrifice to no effect makes this place look like one of the darkest places you could possibly be. He goes on to emphasize this idea even more in just a moment. We came to another place where we found more who were covered with a coarse frost and a bitter chill, but these faced up, unlike the ones before. Here, tears themselves make tears impossible. The grief is blocked, turning inward when it tries to express itself, making pain more painful still, for knots are formed by the first tears each soul cries, resembling a crystal visor as they spread to fill the hollows that surround the eyes. Their eyes are frozen shut as they cry. And here we meet Fra Alberigo. He begs Dante to peel the tears off of his face so that he can cry just a little bit more. "Crack the ice off of my face! Ah!" Dante says, "Tell me who you are who implore. If I fail to help you then, may I be made to go to the bottom of the icy floor. I am Fra Alberigo, and I displayed the fruits of the evil orchard." Dante is surprised here because he doesn't think Fra Alberigo is dead. He thinks, hey, this guy's supposed to be alive. I think I saw him recently. It turns out that Dante's right. Fra Alberigo is still alive, or at least his body is. His soul has been sucked out of his body and dropped into Ptolemaea because he was so evil. He explains, "It often happens that a soul is sped, such as Ptolemaea's privilege, to this place while Atropos has yet to cut its thread. So you may scrape the glazed tears from my face more readily. Let me also say to you that as soon as the soul betrays, as in my case, its body is taken by a devil, who will be master over it and everything, until its allotted time on earth is through. To this cistern, then, the soul comes plummeting. Still walking the earth, perhaps, is the body of this one, who is here behind me wintering. So these sinners are so evil and so treacherous that they have no chance of repentance. There is no hope for them in life, because as soon as they commit that sin, their soul gets sucked straight to hell. And then from then on, a demon takes over their body and continues to control it, which doesn't make much difference because they're pretty horrible demonic people anyway. These are people who are treacherous to their guests. They invited someone into their home and betrayed them. Fra Alberigo received an insult, but he kept quiet about it, and he invited in the person who insulted him and his family and then murdered them at dinner. So as we were mentioning before, it seems as though evil has triumphed here in Canto 33. There seems to be no redemption for sacrifice, the sacrifice of Ungolino's sons. There seems to be no hope of repentance in Fra Alberigo. Evil has triumphed. Evil is very dark and conquering here. And we still have one canto left to go. But before Dante continues on, Fra Alberigo says, "So now reach out your arm and clear my face of the ice around my eyes." But I refused. Betrayal was true courtesy in this case. So Dante refuses to break the ice off his face. After earlier he said, "If I fail to help you then, may I be made to go to the bottom of the icy floor." Dante betrays him and acts with treachery towards Fra Alberigo. And yet he says that this treachery, this betrayal, is a courtesy, as though Fra Alberigo, in his complete darkness and his complete twistedness, deserves betrayal. He gets what's coming to him. Finally, we get to Canto 34, the end of the Inferno. Vexilia regis prodeunt inferni. Virgil points towards this giant windmill figure in the distance and says this Latin line. The line comes from a hymn saying, "The banners of the king advance," talking about God marching forward. But he turns it around and says, "The banners of the hellish king advance." Now, when do you expect to see banners advancing? Well, it's usually at the front of the army, moving forward, taking over and conquering. But this is ironic, because actually Satan isn't moving forward. He's going nowhere. They finally come to the fourth ring of the ninth circle, Judeca, where betrayers of lords and benefactors lie. The wind was raw, and there was nothing else to shelter me. I trembled to make verse of what I saw. The souls were covered over in this place, in ice, like glass-embedded bits of straw. Some are lying flat, some standing in their space, some with heads and some with souls in the ascent. One like a bow with feet bent towards his face. So he describes the souls in Judaica, who he's unable to talk to because they're all frozen in the ice. And they're all twisted up in these awkward poses, showing how twisted they were in life. We continued moving forward. On we went until we reached a place at which it pleased my guide to show me the creature once so radiant. He moved from before me, bade me stop, and cried, "Behold this! Here behold the place where you must summon courage and be fortified." I cannot, reader, do not ask me to, describe the way I felt, for I know that I lack words to tell how cold and weak I grew. I did not live, and yet I did not die, deprived of both states. You may realize what I then became if you have the wit to try. So Dante, upon seeing Satan, becomes so overcome with horror that he faints. And notice again he uses that idea of ineffability. Words cannot express what I see now. But he describes Satan in all of his horrificness as this giant to the giants. If he was as fair as he is foul and grim and dared defy his maker, it is well said that all suffering and sorrow flow from him. He has 3 faces, one yellow, one red, and one black. And in each of the faces, there is a mouth gnawing on a sinner, the 3 worst sinners. He has 6 giant wings that beat fiercely, and that's where the wind is coming from that's freezing all of these souls and numbing poor Dante's face. Tears flowed from his 6 eyes, mixing with a flow of bloody slobber dripping down his 3 chins. Just as hackles mangles flax, a row of teeth in each mouth gripped a soul. He made 3 spirits suffer unremitting woe. The one in the front mouth was far less afraid of his biting than the raking of his nails. At times the spirit's back was wholly flayed. My master said, that one whose fate entails the greatest pain is Judas Iscariot. His head is in the mouth, while his body flails. The other 2, whose heads are hanging out, that is Brutus in the blackface, whose control keeps his tongue silent as he writhes about, and Cassius is that other sinewy soul. Now the night is rising once again, and we must take our leave, for we have seen the whole. Notice how Satan as a guardian doesn't say anything. A lot of people find this kind of anticlimactic. After all, we've talked to all the other guardians on the way down, and we expected to see Satan, this huge monstrosity, and here we get to Satan, and he doesn't even say anything. In fact, the very next thing that happens is Dante jumps on Virgil's back, they run between the wings, jump onto Satan, and climb down his leg through the ice. Then he, when the monstrous wings were open wide, making use of place and time efficiently, took hold of the shaggy fur on the devil's side and climbed down clump by clump, conveying us between the frozen crust and the matted hide. The moment we came to where the thigh joint was, the point at which the haunches spread, was when my leader, with movements pained and strenuous, brought his head round to Satan's shanks and then, just like a climber, grappled on the hair. I thought we had turned back toward hell again. So they climb down and Virgil does this weird maneuver, spinning himself upside down and then starting to climb back up again. Oh, that's cool. And Dante at first thinks they're climbing back up into hell, but then when he pops back out, there are Satan's legs, and they're in a new cavern. Just so happens that they climbed through the center of the earth and came up on the other side, and that little spin movement was where gravity reversed itself. Okay, so here's Satan, who is silenced because his mouths are full. And he's used as a tool for them to escape, a ladder. And he's used as a tool by heaven to freeze the souls and punish them down here with his giant wings and the gusts of wind from them. And furthermore, he's trapped. He's a prisoner. He can't move from the ice. We get to the very last canto, and we see Satan, who we would think would be the king of hell, who would be reigning triumphant over all of this evil, but he's not. He's a prisoner, and he's silenced. The idea of silence is also emphasized by all the other souls we see in this section. All the souls in Judaica are frozen under the ice, silenced. The 3 souls in Satan's mouth are also silent. It makes a special note to point out that Brutus's control keeps his tongue silent as he writhes about. This is because Brutus was a Stoic, and if you remember the story of Julius Caesar, the Shakespeare play, Brutus was known for keeping his emotions in check and holding them back. So he's not a crybaby like Cassius is over there. Of course, if you remember Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, you might remember that Shakespeare has a lot of sympathy for Brutus. Brutus is really a good guy at heart, and he's been misguided. But Dante doesn't have any sympathy for him. He sees him as someone who's betrayed his lord and master. Satan even weeps down here as a prisoner, transformed from that beautiful angelic being to this horrifying monster. But now that Dante and Virgil have escaped from the bottom of the pit, they're in the other side of the world. Dante needs a little bit more explanation before we can finish out. Master, I said when I rose, before I uproot myself from the abyss, I pray that you help me understand a little more. Where is the ice? And why is he set this way, turned upside down? And how did the sun spin in so short a transit from night to day? And he, you think we are still where we've been, on the other side, where I took hold of the hair of the evil worm who gnaws the world from within. As long as I climbed down, you were still there. When I've turned myself, you are where the halves divide, at the center that draws all weights from everywhere. You are under the hemisphere on the opposite side from the one that canopies the vast dry land, beneath whose zenith he was crucified, who was born and lived his life without the brand or taint of sinfulness. This little sphere is Judeca's other face, where your feet now stand. It is evening there when it is morning here, and he whose hair we made a ladder of is still secured where you saw him appear. He fell upon this side from the heavens above, and the land, in terror as he plummeted, used the ocean for a cover as it strove towards our hemisphere. And what was here may have fled, rushing upward as he hurtled through the sky, and leaving this great cavern in its stead. So we finally get an explanation for the geography of Hell and Mount Purgatory both at the same time. Satan was a beautiful angel that was kicked out of heaven and made a fall down to the earth. Ah! And when he hit the earth rushed out of his way, and he fell through to the center, leaving a huge crater that is the Inferno. And on the other side of the world from where humanity lives, all that extra earth that was moving out of his way shoved up through into the sky, making a mountain, Mount Purgatory. That's where we're going next. We entered on that hidden road to find our way once more to the world of light. My leader walked ahead and I behind, without a pause to rest, till we were in sight of a hole that showed some few particulars to those heavenly things that beautify the night. From there we came outside and saw the stars. This last word of the Inferno is the same word that's used at the end of Purgatorio and Paradiso. Each one of these end with the word stars, because at the end of each section, we're looking up to the heavens in hope. And now that they're back on the surface, they're gonna rise and climb Mount Purgatory up towards heaven. Thus ends Dante's Inferno. The end!
Next time on The Divine Comedy.
Look, Virgil, it's Mount Purgatory. Which way do we go now?
Well, actually, I've never been here before.
Virgil, do you have a lint brush? I have Satan fur all over me.
We have a long climb ahead of us.
Look, Virgil, it's like the law of Contrapasso, only it's different. And I just got the other one down.
Bum 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 ba 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 bum. It's Purgatorio, Purgatorio, but bum 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 bum.
The cold never bothered me anyway. Do you want to build a snowman? This is the best we can do in Murfreesboro.